On August 10, 1680, the Pueblo people rose up against Spanish colonizers. For many years, the Pueblo people suffered violence, cruelty, hunger, exploitation of labor and resources, harassment, and persecution for practicing their religious tradition. Despite greater Pueblo numbers, the Spanish were ruthless, organized, and well-armed. The Spanish possessed firearms and steel weapons superior to anything the Puebloans could muster. At one point, Pueblo leaders realized negotiations with the Spaniards was useless, and they would perish if they don't rise up. Fighting was the only option. It was a matter of survival. Each Pueblo community is an autonomous nation, and before this uprising, they never banded together. In order to understand this monumental historical event, we need to go back 140 years, when the Spaniards first arrived in Puebloan lands. The Spaniards first arrived in 1540, following an expedition led by Conquistador Francisco Vázquez de Coronado. The Coronado expedition was sent to look for gold, silver, silk, spice roots, and land that could be used for forced labor, a common and profitable practice in the Spanish-controlled provinces of Mexico. The expedition numbered 2,000 troops, a mix of Spanish soldiers and their native allies from Mexico. They first attacked the Zuni village of Yahuicu. The Zuni were aware of Spanish exploits in Mexico, so they relocated their women, children, and elderly to the Mesotop sanctuary by the time Coronado arrived. Zuni warriors tried to repel the invaders, but the Spaniards had greater numbers and superior weapons, not to mention horses. They attacked and seized the village, but here was no gold as they hoped. Representatives from the Peco Pueblo traveled to meet with the Spaniards. They offered to guide them to wealthy tribes in the east who were conducting raids on them, so dispatching the Spaniards to deal with them probably seemed like a good idea for them at the time. Also, the Spaniards had really interesting things to trade like horses, sheep, and steel. Coronado encountered the Tiwa communities farming the fertile floodplains of the Rio Grande, while traveling to Pecos. Since they were almost out of food and the rations conquered in Zuni land were almost gone, Coronado decided to set up camp for the winter. The Spaniards drove out the Tiwa natives from the Coahua Pueblo and made a military base. Archaeological evidence shows there was a battle for the Pueblo. Coronado demanded supplies from the Tiwa, Cares, and Tiwa Pueblos. They traded what they could, but stopped after some time because they would not last the winter. Coronado ordered his men to take supplies by force, leaving the Pueblos hungry and cold. The Spaniards assaulted women. The Tiwa retaliated by killing some horses and mules. Coronado then ordered an attack on a village near the Tiwa Pueblo named Arenal. The Spaniards killed all the warriors, burning 30 of them alive at stake. The Tiwa fled to a mesa-top stronghold. Coronado couldn't breach their defenses and laid siege from January to March of 1541 until the Tiwa ran out of food and water. They tried to escape, but the Spaniards caught them. They killed all of the men and most of the women. Those women who were not killed were enslaved. Coronado and the Spaniards left later that year. The Spaniards returned on Puebloan land in 1598 with the conquistador Juan de Oñate. Oñate divided the territory into 7 provinces, dispatching priests to each one. The process involved converting native people to Christianity, taxing them and exploiting them for labor and land. Only a few priests tolerated religious practices of the Puebloans. The majority would accuse them of heresy, destroy kivas, the sacred Pueblo chambers used for social and spiritual ceremonies, and a place of worship, forbid ceremonial practices, and destroy sacred objects. Spanish demands of tribute and labor put them in a difficult position, since they already struggled to survive the winter months. In response to this tyranny, the Pueblos frequently rebelled against their oppressors. The uprisings usually involved a handful of Pueblos with insufficient warriors and weapons to be successful. The Spanish authorities often discovered and ruthlessly crushed rebellions before they could organize effectively. They killed the dissidents or sold them as slaves. In 1598, the Acoma Pueblo refused to pay food tribute to the Spaniards. The Acoma leader, Zutacapan, knew the Spaniards would attack them. Knowing how the Spaniards treated those who opposed them, he sent for negotiations. When the two sides met, 17 Spaniards came and demanded food. The natives declined again. Then the Spaniards started assaulting Acoma women. A fight ensued, leaving 12 Spaniards dead. When word got back to the Spaniards on Oñat's orders, 70 soldiers departed to attack the Acoma Pueblo. They arrived in January of 1599. Out of the estimated 6,000 people living in or around Acoma Pueblo, at least 2,000 were warriors. After 3 days of battle, the Spaniards stormed the village after using a cannon. 500 warriors died in battle, along with about 300 women and children. The Spaniards captured approximately 500 people, sentencing every male over the age of 25 to have their right foot cut off and to be enslaved for 20 years. Additionally, they ordered all males between the ages of 12 to 25 and all females over the age of 12 to be enslaved for 20 years. 60 of the youngest women were enslaved and sent to Mexico City. They also arrested 2 Hopi men and cut off one of their hands before releasing them to provide a warning to other pueblos about the cost of defying Spanish rule. When Spanish King Philip heard the news of the massacre and the punishments, Oñate was banished from New Mexico for his cruelty to the natives, and later returned to Spain. Oñate's actions in Acoma were traumatizing and shocking to other pueblos. Despite cultural and linguistic differences, the pueblos and tribes in the region were not strangers to one another, and such news traveled fast, moving into the new century. Basically, nothing changed. Catholic missionaries attempted to eradicate the ancestral Pueblo world in every aspect. The priests dictated what people could believe and how they could marry, work, live their lives, and pray. The governor of New Mexico, Bernardo López de Mendizámo, who served for a year between 1659 and 1660, attempted to lower the power of the priests, prohibiting them from forcing the native population to work for free and acknowledging the right of the Pueblo people to worship according to their traditions, including performing the sacred dances. The Spanish Inquisition convicted him of heresy and condemned him on 33 counts of malfeasance in the practice of Judaism. The priests resumed their policy of religious intolerance. In 1607, the governor of the province established the town of Santa Fe, later designated as capital of the region. In the 1660s and 1670s, drought and unusually high temperatures made life increasingly difficult. All of the native people, from the Puebloans to the Apache, Navajo, and Comanche, were starving. This led to other tribes raiding the Pueblos. When the raiders didn't find food, they would kidnap people and sell them into slavery for food. Even when there was food, the Spaniards would take it, leaving the Puebloans starving. With the Spanish tyrannical rule from one side and other tribes raiding them from the other, the Puebloans found themselves in a very tough situation. The Pueblos attributed their hardships and the prolonged drought on the disruption of their religious practice. With a population estimated to be between 40,000 and 80,000 in the mid-1500s, they were now reduced to an estimated 15,000 by the late 1600s, primarily due to the impact of violence, forced labor, European diseases, and famine. In 1675, Governor Juan Francisco Trevino ordered the arrest of 47 Pueblo medicine men. He accused them of plotting a rebellion. 4 of them were sentenced to death, with 3 being hanged, and the 4th taking his own life. The others were publicly whipped and sentenced to slavery. The Puebloans then surrounded the governor's office in Santa Fe with 70 warriors, demanding the release of their medicine man. Governor Trevino conceded, since the majority of his forces were far out fighting Apache. He didn't want to risk another conflict because the Apaches and the Navajo were becoming increasingly aggressive, putting a strain on his limited military resources. One of those released medicine man was Pope, a Tua medicine man from the San Juan Pueblo. Little is known about Pope prior to his arrest. It's estimated that he was born around 1630, which means he witnessed an age of enormous suffering and hardship. Pope was described as a fierce and dynamic individual who inspired respect bordering on fear in those who dealt with him. After his release from prison, Pope retreated to Taos Pueblo, the northernmost and most isolated one. The residents of the Taos Pueblo had a reputation for aggressively resisting the Spaniards. Pope began to organize and plan a rebellion with a clear objective to drive the Spaniards from ancestral Pueblo and land, eradicate their influence, and return to the traditional ways of life. He began secret negotiations with leaders from almost all of the Pueblos. For 5 years, he secretly traveled to 45 Pueblos, planning and organizing the revolt. He even murdered his son-in-law, Nicholas Bua, fearing he will alert the Spaniards. Even the Apache and Navajo, who were traditionally perceived as enemies, participated, though little is known about their level of involvement in the planning. Pope gained the support of the northern Tiwa, Tua, Toa, Tano, and Cares, speaking Pueblos of the Rio Grande Valley. Pecos Pueblo, 50 miles east of the Rio Grande, committed, as did the Zuni and Hopi, 120 and 200 miles west of the Rio Grande. The 4 southern Tiwa towns near Santa Fe and the Piro Pueblos, near present-day Socorro, did not join the revolt. The southern Tiwa and the Piro were more thoroughly assimilated with the Spanish than the other community. Pope wouldn't risk confiding in them due to concerns about their allegiance. Prior to Spanish arrival, Pueblo communities were not united. They were separated by language and culture. Now, more than 100 years under occupation, they all spoke Spanish and all hated a common enemy. From his base of operations at Taos Pueblo, Pope and his people laid out their plan and coordinated their attack. The date set for the uprising was August 11, 1680. He dispatched runners to all the Pueblos. The runners gave all Pueblos knotted cords. He instructed Pueblo leaders to untie 1 knot from the cord each morning. When the last knot was untied, that would be the day for them to rise united against the Spaniards. He told each Pueblo to burn the church, kill the resident priest, and kill or expel Spanish settlers. The Puebloans planned to destroy the outlying Spanish settlements and converge on Santa Fe to kill or expel the remaining Spaniards. Just before the set date, southern Tiwa leaders warned the Spaniards about the revolt. The Spaniards intercepted 2 of the runners on August 9, 1680. They tortured them until they revealed the significance of the knotted cord. The Spanish population of about 2,400, including mixed blood mestizos and native servants, was scattered throughout the provinces. Santa Fe was the only significant town, with 170 soldiers available for defense. The leaders of the rebellion realized their plan had been compromised, so they decided to start the revolt the following day. They dispatched runners with new instructions, but the Acoma, Zuni, and Hopi Pueblos didn't get the information in time due to the vast distance between Taos and the western Pueblos. They held on the original timeline. On August 10, 1680, Tiwa, and other Carasan-speaking Pueblos, and even the Apaches simultaneously rose up against the Spanish. The Zuni, Hopi, and Acoma were a day late. They stole the Spaniards' horses and sealed off roads leading to Santa Fe. In Santa Fe, Governor Odeman marshaled the city's resources to defend the capital. Pueblo warriors destroyed all of the Spanish settlements in the province by August 13th and converged on the capital. Governor Odeman sent heavily armed relief parties to escort stranded colonists to the relative safety of Santa Fe. Almost 1,000 people sought sanctuary in the governor's palace by August 15th, surrounded by an army of 2,500 native warriors. The Spaniards had no water and limited food. In the meantime, over 1,000 Spanish survivors from the Rio Abajo, under the command of Lieutenant Governor Alonso Garcia, had gathered in Isleta, 70 miles south of Santa Fe. However, neither group was aware of the other. On August 21st, the Spaniards broke out of the governor's palace. They launched a costly counterattack to drive the warriors from the city, which allowed the refugees time to flee. They began the long trek south. The refugees in Isleta were also heading south when they got word about the other survivors. They paused in Socorro, waiting for the refugees from Santa Fe to arrive, and then traveled together on September 27th to El Paso. With heavy firepower on the Spanish side, Puebloan warriors tracked them the entire way, essentially following them to the border. But they didn't attack. The revolt cost 400 Spanish lives and an unknown number of Puebloans. 21 of the 33 priests were killed. However, 2,000 Spaniards survived. After the revolt, Pope became the leader of the Pueblo Alliance for a brief period of time. Pope and his two lieutenants, Alonso Catiti and Luis Tupatu, traveled from town to town, ordering a return to the old ways. They ordered all of the pueblos to destroy crosses, churches, and Christian images. The pueblos restored the kivas. They ordered the people to cleanse themselves in ritual baths, to use their Pueblo names, and to destroy all vestiges of the Christian religion and Spanish culture, including Spanish livestock and fruit trees. Pope forbade the planting of wheat and barley. He commanded those married in the Catholic Church to dismiss their wives and to take others based on Puebloan traditions. Many of the pueblos, not familiar to cooperative political action and accustomed to autonomy, ignored his orders. They resented his effort to rule, and he was considered a tyrant by many. Additionally, there were Puebloans who had sincerely converted to Christianity, and many had family or friends who were Spanish. The Pueblo Council deposed Pope about a year after the revolt, though he was re-elected shortly before his death in 1688. The confederation between the Pueblos fell apart after he died. For 12 years, the Pueblos prevented the Spanish from returning, successfully repelling attempts in 1681 and 1687. However, the drought continued, together with crop failure and famine. Now, since there was no Spanish forces, the Pueblos were subjects of Apache, Navajo, Comanche raiding parties. In 1692, General and Governor of New Mexico, Diego de Vargas, launched a military and political campaign to reclaim Puebloan land. In August 1692, Vargas marched to Santa Fe unopposed. He anticipated opposition in Pecos Pueblo, but they welcomed him. In fact, Pecos provided 140 additional warriors to help him retake Santa Fe. He had 60 Spanish soldiers, 100 native auxiliaries, 7 cannons, and 1 Franciscan priest. Vargas arrived in Santa Fe in September and met with 1,000 Puebloans, promising them protection if they swear allegiance to the King of Spain. The negotiations went on for several days. In the end, the Puebloans accepted, since the Spaniards were not viewed as the worst enemy anymore. Vargas visited other pueblos during the following month, forcing Spanish rule. Sometimes he encountered resistance, but often he received a warm reception. The returning Spanish were not so strict anymore, and now saw the pueblos as a buffer zone between them, the English and the French. They perceived Puebloans as potential allies. However, this doesn't mean hostilities didn't occur anymore. Vargas increased severe control in the early 1690s. Because of that, In 1693, when he came to Santa Fe one day, he found 70 warriors and 400 members of their families blocking his way. He ordered his troops to attack, resulting in a quick victory for the Spaniards. Vargas executed the warriors and sentenced their family members to 10 years of slavery. In 1696, 14 pueblos attempted a second organized revolt. They killed 5 missionaries and 34 settlers, which provoked a prolonged and unmerciful response from Vargas. By the end of the 1600s, Vargas secured the surrender of the majority of pueblos in the region, though many Puebloans fled, joining Apache or Navajo group. The Spanish never convinced some pueblos to pledge allegiance to the Spanish Empire, and they were far enough away to make attempts at reconquest impractical. For example, the Hopi remained free of any Spanish attempt at reconquest, though the Spanish did launch several unsuccessful attempts to secure a peace treaty or a trade deal. In that regard, for some pueblos, the revolt successfully diminished the European influence on their way of life. The revolt and the aftermath decimated the Spanish and the Puebloans. Puebloan independence from the Spaniards was brief, however. Spanish efforts to eradicate their culture and religion ceased. The revolt may also have increased the spread of horses onto the Great Plains. The Spanish adapted their outlook and policies, which may have spared additional atrocities. As they expanded their empire west into California, they prohibited forced labor and demands for tributes in New Mexico. Furthermore, the Spaniards issued substantial land grants to each pueblo and appointed a public defender to protect their rights and argue their legal cases in Spanish courts. The priests returning to New Mexico altered their approach as well, becoming more tolerant of Puebloan religious expression. The revolt helped ensure cultural survival and demonstrated the resilience of the Pueblo people. It is one reason the Pueblos continued to maintain their lands, languages, customs, and religion. Pueblo warriors and Spanish soldiers later became allies in the fight against their common enemies, the Apache, Navajo, and Comanche. The Apache, Navajo,